The 31st of May, 1918. On the Aisne front, the German war machine readied itself for yet another massive thrust against the beleaguered French lines. No one in those ranks could have imagined that in a matter of hours, they would confront a weapon that would fundamentally rewrite the rules of combat for the next 100 years. As the spectral morning mist began to thin, they appeared. 30 small, almost fragile machines, scarcely taller than a man, crawling from the gray obscurity. The German soldiers stared in confusion. These were not the behemoths the British had unleashed. They were strange, compact iron boxes on churning tracks, each crowned with a revolutionary, fully rotating turret. For a few moments, there was only bewilderment. Then, the turrets swiveled, and the tiny monsters opened fire. Machine guns and light cannons spat death into the German positions. The machines advanced methodically, crushing barbed wire entanglements under their weight and effortlessly bridging trenches. The psychological shock was absolute. Entire units of the Kaiser's army, men who had endured years of brutal warfare, broke in panic, surrendering en masse. They had just met the Renault FT. At a mere 7 tons, this was the machine that would forever alter the face of war. The direct ancestor of every main battle tank, from the American Abrams to the Russian T-90. To comprehend the revolution this small French machine represented, one must journey back into the hellscape of the Great War. By 1917, the Western Front had devolved into a singular, unbroken scar of human misery, a maelstrom of mud, rusted wire, and water-filled craters stretching for hundreds of kilometers from the cold waters of the North Sea to the Swiss frontier. Any attempt at an offensive had become a ritual of slaughter. Infantry, ordered over the top, would be met by a scythe of machine gun fire, suffering catastrophic losses for mere meters of obliterated earth. Thousands of lives were traded for 4 meters of ground, territory that could in these futile assaults. Morale had plummeted to the point of collapse, culminating in mass mutinies across several divisions in 1917, as soldiers refused to participate in yet another suicidal charge. The British had made the first technical attempt to break this deadlock. On the 15th of September 1916, their gargantuan rhomboid-shaped Mark series tanks lumbered into battle on the Somme. These immense steel beasts made an incredible impression, but they were plagued by crippling deficiencies. They were monstrously slow, their speed dropping to just 3 or 4 kilometers per hour across broken terrain. Worse was the ordeal for the 8-man crew, who were effectively being cooked alive. Suffocating on heat and exhaust fumes in a compartment where temperatures could soar to 50 degrees Celsius, men would simply collapse from heat stroke and asphyxiation after little more than an hour of combat. The Renault FT was the answer. It was not a mobile fortress, it was a mechanical predator. It embodied a new doctrine where speed, numbers, and tactical flexibility replaced brute force. It was the first true vision of the future, a future where the relentless, grinding attrition of human flesh would give way to the decisive violence of the machine. The first great leviathans of the battlefield were not merely machines of war. They were brutal, mechanical puzzles. To command such a beast was a symphony of chaos. Within the British Mark series tanks, it demanded no fewer than 4 men, working in near telepathic coordination simply to steer the colossal machine. One mistake, one moment of hesitation in the deafening cacophony, and the landship would lurch uselessly off course. The very design of these pioneers betrayed their experimental nature. Their main armaments, housed in sponsons on the flanks of the hull, were fixed, unable to traverse independently. This created vast, terrifying blind spots, dead zones where enemy infantry could approach with impunity. While the British grappled with these challenges, their French allies were embarking on their own troubled journey into the age of armored warfare. Their first answer, arriving at the front in the early months of 1917, was the Schneider CA-1. Weighing 13.5 tons, it was a design born from the chassis of an American Holt tractor, a heritage it could never escape. It appeared as a long, brutalist box of steel perched on its tracks, millimeter cannon in a right-side sponson, supplemented by two 8mm Hotchkiss machine guns. Inside, a crew of 6 men was condemned to a claustrophobic inferno. The heat was suffocating, but it was the air itself that became the enemy. The concentration of engine exhaust fumes was so thick that crewmen would regularly lose consciousness in the heat of battle, slumping over their controls as the fight raged outside. Yet the Schneider's most terrifying flaw was its catastrophic inability to traverse the very ground it was built to conquer. It suffered from a dangerously high center of gravity and a short track base, a fatal combination on the scarred landscape of the Western Front. The machine would constantly founder in shell craters, capsize while attempting to cross trenches, and behave with violent unpredictability on any uneven terrain. Its combat debut during the Nivelle offensive on the 16th of April 1917 was not a trial by fire, it was a wholesale disaster. Of the 132 tanks that lumbered into the attack, 57 were consumed by German artillery or anti-tank fire. The majority of the survivors never even reached the enemy, left instead as helpless steel monuments to failure, mired in the mud and craters of no man's land. If the Schneider was a flawed concept, more ill-conceived. At 23 tons, it was the heaviest tank of the First World War, a truly monstrous construction. Its impossibly long hull, also built upon the Holt tractor chassis, featured an enormous front overhang, where its powerful 75mm cannon was mounted. A crew of 9 men endured the same suffocating conditions as their comrades in the Schneider, choked by heat and toxic fumes. On paper, the Saint-Chamond was a veritable fortress, better armed than any contemporary. In addition to its main gun, it carried 4 8mm machine guns, making it a formidable weapon platform. But a fortress that cannot move is merely a tomb. The Saint-Chamond's mobility was even worse than its predecessors. The long, heavy nose would bury itself in the earth when crossing the slightest obstacle. It became hopelessly stuck in trenches only 2 meters wide and would tip over on even gentle slopes. It was a machine utterly unsuited for the cratered moonscape of the Western Front. Its first battle, on the 5th of May 1917, became a grim farce. Of 16 Saint-Chamonds sent into the fray, 15 became bogged down before they had traveled even 100 meters from their own lines. Only a single tank managed to crawl its way to the German positions. The French High Command saw the truth with brutal clarity. Both of their creations were evolutionary dead ends, crude and clumsy beasts born of desperation. They were the terrible, necessary price of innovation, failed experiments paid for in steel and blood, whose wreckage littered the path toward a more perfect and more lethal instrument of war. The Great War had ground to a halt, mired in a stalemate of mud, wire, and machine guns. The initial clumsy attempts at armored warfare had proven that the concept had merit, but the instruments themselves were deeply flawed. A new path was desperately needed. In France, the chief visionary of the nascent armored corps was a general named Jean-Baptiste Estienne, a man who had long pondered the application of armored machines on the battlefield, closely monitoring every experiment in the field. Estienne's doctrine was a radical departure from that of his British allies. He saw their use of tanks, deployed singly or in small, vulnerable groups, as a tragic misuse of potential. He envisioned not a handful of steel beasts supporting infantry, but a tidal wave of armor, a swarm of machines that would overwhelm the enemy through sheer, relentless numbers, shattering defensive lines and pouring into the vulnerable rear. But such a strategy required a new kind of weapon. The existing French tanks, the Schneider and the Saint-Chamond, were mechanical behemoths, too complex, too costly, and far too unreliable for the mass production Estienne's vision demanded. They could be built in the hundreds. He needed to build them in the thousands. His search for a creator led him away from the traditional military arsenals and into the heart of French industry. His choice fell upon a man who had never built a tank, who possessed absolutely no experience with tracked vehicles. Louis Renault. Renault was a legend of the automotive world. As early as the late 19th century, at the tender age of 21, he had single-handedly created his first automobile, pioneering the direct-drive transmission and drive shaft, a revolutionary solution that became the standard for the entire industry. By 1917, Louis Renault was 39 years old. His factories, among the largest in Europe, had been turned over to the war effort, churning out trucks, aircraft engines, and munitions. He was, by any measure, one of the finest engineers in France. Yet when General Estienne approached him with the proposal to design a light tank, many of his colleagues dismissed the venture as a hopeless fantasy. Estienne's demands were precise, and to the engineers of the day they seemed to border on the impossible. The machine had to be light, weighing no more than 8 tons, allowing it to be transported by common trucks and standard railway flat cars. It had to be agile and reasonably fast, capable of breaking through the front and operating deep within the enemy's defenses. It required a radical simplicity of design, making it cheap enough to be manufactured on an unprecedented scale. And then came the most revolutionary requirement. It must possess a fully rotating turret, granting it the ability to engage targets in any direction without the clumsy, time-consuming need to pivot the entire hull. Finally, it had to be reliable, capable of navigating the hellscape of the front, the trenches, the craters, and the endless obstacles of no man's land. The task seemed insurmountable. Every existing tank was a lumbering, slow, and fragile giant, with its weapons locked in fixed positions. Estienne was asking for its complete opposite. Louis Renault, the automotive industrialist, accepted the challenge. He dove into the project, designated simply FT, an abbreviation for the French char léger, or light tank. He approached the problem not as a weapons designer, but as the engineer he was, with a mind honed on efficiency, mass production, and mechanical elegance. In that moment, a fundamental shift occurred. The future of armored warfare was no longer chained to the concept of the colossal landship. A new philosophy was being forged in steel, one where victory would be achieved not by size, but by speed, number, and intelligent design. In the crucible of the Great War, the battlefield was dominated by lumbering steel behemoths. These were the first tanks, monstrous landships born of brutal necessity, yet deeply flawed in their conception. They were clumsy, mechanically fragile, and tactically blind. But amidst this orthodoxy of brute force, one engineer chose to begin anew. He swept aside the existing doctrines of armored design, starting not from what a tank was, but from what it should be. His only guides were the unwavering laws of mechanics and the stark clarity of common sense. His first revolutionary act addressed the very soul of the machine, its layout. With a stroke of genius, he placed the engine in the rear of the hull, the driver's compartment at the very front, and between them, a fully rotating turret housing the armament and the commander. To the modern eye, this arrangement seems self-evident. The engine, the heart of the beast, pushes the vehicle forward from behind. The driver, its eyes, sees the path ahead and controls its movement. And the commander, its brain, sits high in a traversing turret, granted a panoramic view and the ability to bring fire to bear in any direction. Yet until that moment, no one had conceived of such a perfect, logical harmony. This single decision was so profoundly correct that it became the immutable standard, the very blueprint for nearly every tank built for the next 100 years. The second innovation was the turret itself. Today, it is the defining feature of a tank. But in 1917, a rotating gun platform was an engineering enigma. The tanks of the era sponson blisters. This created vast, lethal blind spots. To engage a target to the flank or rear, the entire multi-ton machine had to laboriously pivot its body, a slow and vulnerable dance of death. The engineer understood that for a light, maneuverable tank designed to pierce deep into enemy lines, the ability to fight in all directions was not a luxury. It was the key to survival. The challenge was immense. The turret had to be light enough for a single human to rotate it manually, yet robust enough to deflect a hail of bullets and shell fragments. His solution was a cylinder of rolled armored steel, 22 millimeters thick, mounted on a precision ball-bearing race. It could be swung a full 360 degrees by the commander inside, using nothing more than his own strength. There were no complex hydraulic systems, no temperamental electric motors, only the quiet elegance of superior mechanical engineering and the precise fitting of perfectly machined parts. It was a marvel of rugged simplicity, born for the chaos of combat. His third stroke of genius was a feature that became the tank's visual signature, a distancer to a deadly question posed by the landscape of the Western Front, a landscape scarred and broken by countless trenches. These defensive gashes, often 2.5 meters wide, were formidable tank traps. A vehicle with a short-track base would attempt to cross. Its nose would dip and plunge into the trench, its rear would lift into the air, and the machine would become hopelessly stuck, an immobile target for enemy guns. The engineer extended the track base with this curved steel tail. As the tank crossed a trench, this tail would make contact with the far edge, preventing the rear from lifting and providing the leverage needed to pull the rest of the hull across. It was a masterstroke of geometric simplicity, transforming a fatal obstacle into a surmountable one. Through these three core principles, a logical layout, a rotating turret, and a purpose-built chassis, a new paradigm was forged. The silhouette of this machine would echo through the decades, its fundamental design philosophy shaping the course of armored warfare and becoming the very definition of the modern tank. It stands as a testament to the power of a single, clear vision to not only build a better machine, but to reshape the future of conflict itself. To conquer the chasm of the trench, a unique and deceptively simple innovation was devised. As the forward section of the machine dipped into the void, a distinctive tail assembly at the rear would make contact with the far edge, acting as a fulcrum. This allowed the entire tank to pivot smoothly over the obstacle and continue its inexorable advance. This elegant solution worked with near-perfect reliability, enabling the Renault FT to traverse trenches up to 1.8 meters in width, a capability that covered the absolute majority of such fortifications on the Western Front. The machine's ability to navigate this broken earth rested upon its running gear. Power was transmitted to two large-diameter drive wheels situated at the rear of the hull, complemented by smaller idler wheels at the front. Between them, 5 road wheels on each side bore the vehicle's weight. The tracks themselves were relatively wide, a critical design choice that ensured an effective distribution of the machine's mass across the surface, allowing it to move over soft, churned ground without becoming hopelessly mired. Yet its suspension was a study in brutal pragmatism. It was completely rigid, utterly devoid of any shock absorbers or springs. For the crew entombed within, every journey, especially across uneven terrain, was a punishing, bone-jarring ordeal. But this unforgiving design was a deliberate sacrifice made for the sake of efficiency. The construction was reliable, astonishingly inexpensive to produce, and required virtually no maintenance. It perfectly embodied the concept of a mass-produced weapon, a tank that was destined to be manufactured not in dozens, but in the thousands. At its heart, the Renault was powered by a gasoline engine of its own design. A 4.5-liter four-cylinder unit, it developed a mere 39 horsepower at 1,500 revolutions per minute. By modern standards, the figure seems almost laughable, scarcely enough power for a scooter or a lawnmower. But in the context of 1917, it was an entirely respectable output for a vehicle weighing 7 tons. The engine was brought to life either by an external hand crank, inserted through a special aperture in the rear of the hull, or by an internal crank the driver could operate, a profoundly awkward and difficult task within the cramped confines of his station. Its 95-liter fuel tank provided an operational range of approximately 48 kilometers on roads, or a mere 30 kilometers across the battlefield. The transmission featured a gearbox with 4 forward speeds and 1 reverse, affording the tank a maximum speed of just 7 kilometers per hour on a level surface. Control of the machine was the sole responsibility of the driver, who sat in the forward part of the hull, his view of the world reduced to a narrow horizontal slit. To turn, he manipulated 2 control levers, a classic system linked to the brakes of each track, a principle that has defined tracked vehicle operation ever since. Pulling the right lever would brake the right track, causing the tank to slew to the right. A pull on the left lever initiated a turn to the left. For a sharp pivot on the spot, the driver would lock one track completely and apply power, forcing the machine to spin around its stationary track. It was a collection of simple, robust, and sometimes cruel systems. The ride was punishing, the speed was glacial, the view a sliver of a violent world. Yet in this synthesis of crude mechanics and revolutionary purpose, a new form of warfare was being born, one defined not by the static line, but by the relentless, grinding advance of armored steel. The system of control was one of brutal simplicity, a design born of necessity. Yet for the man at the levers, simple did not mean easy. On the churned, unforgiving earth of the battlefield, every correction of course demanded a significant exertion of physical force. The driver was in a constant state of struggle, wrestling with the machine, fighting to impose his will upon the tons of steel as it lurched across the mud and shell holes of no man's land. This new weapon, the Renault FT, came to the front in 2 distinct incarnations, each defined by the instrument of death it carried. The cannon variant was armed with a short-barreled Puteaux 37mm gun. With a barrel length of just 21 calibers, it was specifically engineered for the claustrophobic confines of a tank turret. Its projectiles did not fly with the ferocious velocity needed to pierce the armor of other tanks. Its purpose was more fundamental. It was a blunt instrument for smashing the stalemate of the trenches. It excelled at obliterating machine gun nests, collapsing dugouts, and tearing gaping passages through the ubiquitous barbed wire. With a complement of 237 high-explosive fragmentation shells stowed in racks throughout the hull and turret, it could methodically dismantle the enemy's frontline defenses. Its counterpart was the machine gun variant. This version carried an 8mm Hotchkiss model of 1914, its barrel cooled by the passing air. It was fed not by flexible belts, but by rigid metal strips, each holding 24 cartridges. With a staggering 4,800 rounds of ammunition on board, it could unleash a sustained torrent of fire, suppressing enemy infantry, and inside this steel shell, the human element was reduced to its absolute minimum. The crew consisted of just 2 men, a driver and a commander. This radical efficiency, made possible by the tank's compact dimensions, placed an almost unbearable burden upon the commander. He was not merely an officer, he was a one-man fire control team. In the heat of battle, he had to simultaneously search for targets, physically rotate the heavy turret, aim the main armament, load the next round, and fire. All the while, he was expected to maintain situational awareness, direct the driver's movements through the chaos, and make critical tactical decisions under the constant threat of enemy fire. This symphony of violence was conducted from within a cramped, suffocating turret, a steel crucible where a single mistake could be the last. The driver's world was no less punishing. His view of the battlefield was a narrow slit, a sliver of terrifying reality. The deafening cacophony of the engine and transmission was a physical assault, while the acrid bite of exhaust fumes seeped relentlessly into the compartment. As the tank traversed the cratered landscape, it pitched and bucked with such violence that even with a padded leather helmet, the driver was constantly slammed against the interior walls of the hull. Its protection was a calculated compromise. The armor was differentiated. Thickests and rear were a mere 8 millimeters. The roof and floor, a scant 6. The cast turret offered the greatest security, with 22 millimeters of steel at its front and 16 on its sides and rear. This was enough to defeat rifle and machine gun bullets at any practical range, and to shrug off the deadly spray of shrapnel from artillery bursts. But it was never intended to withstand a direct hit from an enemy cannon, or from the high-velocity rounds of the anti-tank rifles that German stormtroopers began to field in late 1917. The designers at Renault understood this limitation. To make the FT impervious to artillery would have rendered it too heavy, too slow, and too expensive for mass production. Its very concept was predicated not on invincibility, but on overwhelming numbers. It was a tool for breakthrough, a key designed to unlock the deadlock of trench warfare. It was a machine that demanded an almost superhuman effort from its crew, a microcosm of the Great War itself, where the limits of human endurance were tested against the cold, unyielding logic of industrial steel. A new doctrine was taking shape in the brutal calculus of attrition that defined the Western Front. It was a strategy born of desperation and vision, one that called for a weapon to penetrate deep into the enemy's defenses, a machine to act not as a lumbering fortress, but as a swift predator against infantry and unarmored targets, all while evading the deadly gaze of artillery. From this radical concept, the Renault FT emerged. The speed of its creation was a feat of engineering almost unthinkable amidst the chaos of total war. By the end of February 1917, the first prototype was complete. From the initial lines on a drafting table to a fully functional tracked vehicle, a mere handful of months had passed. On the 22nd of February, on a proving ground scarred by the mock battles of Champagne, the prototype was unveiled before a military commission. The results were not merely successful, they were revolutionary. The diminutive tank, a fraction of the size of its British and French predecessors, moved with an astonishing agility. It effortlessly conquered trenches, navigated the churned earth of gaping shell craters, and tore through dense tangles of barbed wire. It clawed its way up muddy inclines, demonstrating a nimbleness and all-terrain capability that the ponderous heavy tanks could never hope to match. General Jean Estienne, the father of French armored forces, was ecstatic. He saw before him the future of land warfare and immediately demanded the commencement of serial production, insisting on the maximum possible numbers. Yet, a chorus of doubt arose from the skeptics within the War Ministry. They questioned how such a small machine, a veritable hornet compared to the land battleships they knew, could possibly be effective on the battlefield. They insisted on further trials, on endless refinements to the design. And so, through the spring and summer of 1917, Louis Renault and his engineers toiled relentlessly. They dissected every weakness, strengthening every component. The transmission was redesigned for greater durability, the suspension reinforced to withstand the constant shock of the battlefield, and the engine's cooling system was profoundly improved. The turret, the tank's defining feature with its full 360-degree traverse, was perfected, its rotation mechanism made smoother and more reliable. By the autumn of that year, the design was finally locked. The Renault FT was deemed ready, and the gears of French industry began to turn. Preparations for mass production commenced not only at the Renault works, but at a constellation of factories across the nation. The French High Command laid out an ambitious plan, an initial order of 3,500 tanks to be delivered by the spring of 1918. It was a force of unprecedented scale, intended to spearhead a massive offensive that would finally break the deadlock of the trenches and turn the tide of the war in favor of the Allies. Production began in late 1917, a symphony of decentralized manufacturing. The Renault factories were joined by the industrial might of Berliet in Lyon and Saumur in Saint-Ouen. The entire process was engineered for simplicity and speed. Guillotine shears sliced through sheets of armor plate, which were then assembled onto a basic frame with rivets. This method did not require a highly skilled workforce, allowing workshops across the country to rapidly increase their output. Engines and transmissions, already perfected on Renault's automotive assembly lines, were readily available. Tracks and road wheels were outsourced to metallurgical firms, while the turrets were stamped and forged in the great artillery plants. By the spring of 1918, the trickle had become a flood. Production reached full capacity, and the small, formidable tanks began to arrive at the front not one by one, but by the dozens each week. The French command organized them into special tank companies, each comprising 20 machines, designed to operate in close concert with the infantry, supporting their advance with fire and maneuver. At the purpose-built training ground in Champleux, a new generation of warrior was forged. Drivers and commanders learned the intimate mechanics of their machines, mastering the art of navigating the broken earth and firing their cannons and machine guns with lethal precision. They were not merely learning to operate a vehicle, they were learning a new language of war. The Renault FT was more than steel and rivets, more than an engine and a gun. It was a concept made manifest, a blueprint for the future of conflict, its silhouette destined to define the very shape of the tank for the next century. It was the humble mechanical ancestor of every main battle tank to come, a small machine that cast a very long shadow over history. The art of mastering this new machine of war was a brutal, compressed education. Training for a tank crew, a course in navigating chaos and coordinating with infantry, lasted a mere 2 to 4 weeks, a fraction of the time demanded to forge a pilot or an artilleryman. The recruits were not raw youths pulled from the farm, but men with a prior intimacy with the machine age. They were mechanics and truck drivers, their hands already calloused from wrestling with engines and transmissions. This existing expertise, this innate understanding of the internal combustion engine, dramatically accelerated their transformation into armored combatants. By May of 1918, the French army possessed a formidable new weapon: several hundred battle-ready FT tanks, each manned by these freshly minted crews. They were an untested force, poised on the edge of history. Their crucible would be the forests near Villers-Cotterêts. Here, the German war machine was grinding forward in its great spring offensive, a final, desperate gamble to break the Allied lines and seize Paris. In the face of this existential threat, the French High Command chose not to defend, but to attack, unleashing their new armored vanguard in a decisive counterstroke intended to shatter the German advance and stabilize the fracturing front. In the pre-dawn hours, under the damp chill of a thick fog, the machines moved to their starting positions. The mist was a blessing, a dense shroud of white that concealed their approach from enemy observation posts. As the sun began to burn through the haze, the order was given. 30 small steel behemoths lurched into motion simultaneously, a wide, clattering chain of innovation advancing across no man's land. They chewed through the rusted wire that had defined the war for 4 years, their cannons and machine guns spitting fire into the German trenches. The response was immediate but futile. German infantrymen, their reactions honed by years of static warfare, opened up with rifles and machine guns. But the bullets that had claimed millions of lives now sparked harmlessly against the hardened steel plates, whining away into the scarred earth. A few anti-tank crews, startled by this unholy apparition, swung their guns around for direct fire. Yet the tanks were not static pillboxes. They were nimble, maneuvering constantly, changing direction with a mechanical lurch that threw off the gunners' frantic calculations. The physical impact was significant, but the psychological effect was cataclysmic. It surpassed all expectations of the French command. The German soldier, exhausted by 4 years of attrition, conditioned to fear the whistle of artillery and the chatter of machine guns, was utterly unprepared for this. Here were armored monsters that were immune to his rifle, that could crush his fortifications under their treads and methodically strafe his trench line with impunity. The logic of the battlefield had been inverted. For many German units, the sight was simply too much. Bewilderment turned to primal fear. Entire sections began to fall back without even engaging, their discipline shattered. Others surrendered in whole platoons, their hands raised in disbelief at the sight of the approaching steel. Behind this armored shield, the French infantry advanced, suffering minimal losses as they swept forward, seizing one German position after another. By the end of the day, the German offensive in this sector had been completely broken. On some fronts, the enemy had been thrown back several kilometers. The success was unequivocal, a thunderous validation of a new and terrifying doctrine. General Pétain, now commander-in-chief of the French army, saw the future in the mud and splintered trees of Villers-Cotterêts. He issued immediate orders to increase tank production to the absolute maximum possible, to form as many new armored companies as could be equipped. The age of the massed light tank had been born. By July of 1918, the French army would field over 300 of these revolutionary machines, deploying them in every major engagement. The static, grinding stalemate of the trenches was finally being broken, not by flesh and blood, but by the relentless, remorseless advance of steel. The summer of 1918. A tide of men, the American Expeditionary Force, was turning the grim arithmetic of the Western Front. They brought fresh resolve and immense industrial might. Yet this new army harbored a profound, almost anachronistic vulnerability. In an age where the stalemate of the trenches was being broken by steel, the Americans had no tanks of their own. Their nascent armored ambitions were entirely dependent on the factories and goodwill of their French allies. The solution arrived in the form of 144 machines, the revolutionary Renault FT. These were not the lumbering land ships of the early war, but light, agile vehicles, each with a fully rotating turret, a design that would define the tank for a century to come. From this small contingent, the first American tank units would be born. Command was entrusted to a 32-year-old captain, a man steeped in the traditions of the cavalry, George Smith Patton, Jr. He was an officer of horse and saber who had never before dealt with armored warfare. But in the churning gears and clattering treads of this new weapon, he recognized the future. He met the challenge not with reluctance, but with a ferocious, all-consuming enthusiasm. Patton traveled personally to the French tank proving grounds at Champleau. For weeks, he immersed himself in the world of the machine. He studied its construction, mastered its operation, and dissected its tactical possibilities. He was not merely a commander, he became a student, and then a master. Returning to his men, he began to forge America's first tank crews. He proved to be a natural, quickly grasping the strengths and weaknesses of the FT. He developed his own doctrine, a philosophy of violence that called for intimate, fluid cooperation with the infantry, for rapid, deep thrusts into the enemy's defenses, and for the immediate, relentless exploitation of any breakthrough without pause or regrouping. His training methods were as aggressive as his tactics. Patton was there in the mud and the grease, personally driving the tanks, firing their cannons, and forcing them over obstacles. He demanded from his subordinates the utmost commitment and a cultivated predatory aggression for the coming fight. That fight came on the 12th of September 1918. In the gray dawn of the Saint-Mihiel salient, American forces, supported by the French, launched a massive offensive against German positions along a front stretching for nearly 30 kilometers. It was here that Patton's tank brigade would receive its baptism of fire. Patton led the charge, not from the relative safety of a command post, nor from the turret of a tank, but on foot. Striding ahead of his steel behemoths, an almost cavalier figure with a walking stick in his hand, he became a living beacon amidst the maelstrom of enemy fire. He walked through the chaos, calmly pointing out targets, directing the flow of the assault with shouts and gestures, his sheer audacity inspiring the crews within their steel hulls. When several of his tanks bogged down in the cratered earth and deep trenches, he did not abandon them. Under withering machine gun fire, he personally organized their recovery, directing the work as bullets tore through the air around him. The effect was decisive. The American tanks smashed through the first line of German defenses. They systematically silenced machine gun nests and tore gaping holes in the barbed wire, clearing a path for the infantry to advance with stunningly minimal losses. For his extraordinary valor, Patton was awarded one of America's highest honors for courage and promoted to lieutenant colonel. His brigade was forged in that fire, emerging as one of the most effective and feared units in the American Expeditionary Corps. This single battle was a microcosm of a larger storm. The 100 Days Offensive, which had begun on the 8th of August, became the Renault FT's coronation. By this time, the French army alone fielded more than 3,000 of these machines, organized into dedicated tank battalions and brigades. Their massed application across the entire front, from the North Sea to Verdun, precipitated the final shattering collapse of the German defenses. The age of trench warfare was over, ground into the mud under the relentless advance of the tank. The Great War was breathing its last, but a new form of conflict was being born. On the fields of France, a new trinity of warfare, speed, armor, and firepower, had been irrevocably established. Forged by a horseman who saw the future, it was a brutal lesson that would echo through the decades, shaping the very nature of the wars to come. They were the iron vanguard of a new age. In the final convulsive months of the Great War, these machines clawed their way across the cratered earth, crushing strong points, silencing artillery batteries, and sowing a terrifying panic deep within the enemy's rear. After 4 years of relentless slaughter, the German army was a hollowed-out shell, its reserves depleted, its spirit broken. It could not withstand such a mechanized onslaught. The front began to unravel, the lines of trenches and wire giving way as the army fell back eastward, surrendering one hard-won position after another. Over the course of 100 days, the Allied advance was relentless, a tide of steel and men that pushed forward for hundreds of kilometers. They liberated the whole of occupied France, then Belgium, until at last they stood at the very frontier of Germany itself. The American High Command, witnessing the profound success of these French tanks, resolved to create its own armored fist. A contract was signed with the Van Dorn Iron Works Company, a monumental order to produce 4,400 licensed copies of the Renault FT. Production commenced in the autumn of 1918, but the effort was fraught with difficulty. American industry, for all its might, stumbled. Technical challenges and a sheer lack of experience among its engineers meant the assembly lines moved at a glacial pace. By the armistice on the 11th of November, only 952 machines had been completed. Not a single one would taste the fire of the European front. With the guns falling silent, France found itself the custodian of a vast steel arsenal. Thousands of Renault FT tanks, once the key to victory, were now a surplus of a war that was over. The French government, practical as ever, initiated an ambitious program of export, and soon the little tank began a global odyssey. It became a seed of armored warfare, scattered across every continent. Poland acquired several hundred, deploying them with decisive effect in its war against Soviet Russia in 1920. Finland received 32, turning them against the Red Army in the frozen north. The list of operators became a roll call of nations. Romania, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Belgium, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, China, Japan, and even distant Brazil. All, at one time or another, fielded the French design. Some nations went further, not just purchasing but producing their own variants. Italy built around 100 tanks under the designation Fiat 3000. A direct descendant of the French original. The Renault FT became a veteran of nearly every major and minor military conflict of the interwar period. During the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, it fought on both sides of the brutal conflict. But here its age began to show. By then it was hopelessly obsolete, a relic from another era. Its thin armor and slow speed were no match for the more modern Soviet T-26 and German Panzer I tanks that were shaping the future of warfare. In China, the FT was pitted against invading Japanese forces, but with minimal success. The machines were technically worn out, and the absence of spare parts rendered them increasingly ineffective. By the dawn of the Second World War, the FT was still officially on the roster of several European armies, including those of Poland, Romania, and France itself, where it had been relegated to training duties and the protection of rear-echelon facilities. Yet, it was destined for one final tragic act. When the German army unleashed its blitzkrieg on the West in May of 1940, several dozen of these old tanks were thrown into the fray in a desperate, futile attempt to halt the panzer divisions. In this last stand, the crews of these machines, men piloting museum pieces against the most advanced military force on Earth, demonstrated a courage that bordered on the sublime. The machine itself was surpassed, its steel long rendered obsolete. But the idea it embodied, a self-propelled armored weapon capable of breaking any stalemate, had already conquered the world. It was a ghost on the battlefields of 1940, but its progeny were everywhere, locked in a struggle that would redefine the very concept of power. The Renault FT was not merely a tank. It was the blueprint for all tough, all the wars yet to come. Against the Blitzkrieg's modern panzers and high-velocity anti-tank guns, the French FT was a ghost from another war. Its crew's courage was no match for its hopelessly obsolete design. The result was a brutal, foregone conclusion. In the opening days of the invasion, nearly all were annihilated or abandoned, their crews killed or captured. The German war machine, however, saw value in the vanquished. Several hundred operational tanks were seized and pressed into a new, inglorious service, guarding airfields, railway junctions, and other rear-echelon targets. Some were stripped down, their chassis repurposed as self-propelled artillery platforms. The last echoes of the FT's combat career were heard between 1944 and 1945, in the desperate hands of partisans across occupied Europe. From its first battle to its last defiant shot, nearly 30 years had passed, an incredible lifespan for a machine of war. The small, symmetrical tank had not just changed the face of battle, it had laid the very foundation for all armored warfare to come, only to be consumed by the relentless progress it had once pioneered.